She's senile. She won't remember anything. Hui said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, loud enough that the man from the notary's office looked up from his papers, loud enough that even the neighbor's dog stopped barking outside the gate. He said it the way you'd comment on the weather, the way you'd mention that rice was getting expensive this year. Casual, certain, final. I was standing by the ancestral altar when he said it. A stick of incense still smoking between my fingers, the thin gray thread of it curling up past my husband's photograph and dissolving into the rafters. The afternoon light came slanting through the open door behind me, catching dust in the air, catching the gold thread in the altar cloth my mother had embroidered 50 years ago. I did not turn around right away. I finished lighting the incense. I planted it in the bronze bowl. 3 sticks. The way I always did. The way I had done every morning and every important occasion since my husband passed. Then I turned, and I looked at my son, my adopted son. The boy I had raised since he was 19. The boy whose fevers I had nursed through 3 different hospital wards over the years. The boy I had taught to read a blood pressure gauge before he could properly shave. He did not look away from me. That was new. For 30 years, he had never been able to hold my gaze for more than a few seconds. Now he held it like a man holding a winning hand of cards. I smiled. Not a big smile. Just a small lift at the corner of my mouth. The kind of smile you give a child who has said something foolish in front of guests. The kind of smile that says nothing and everything at once. I said nothing. I did not defend myself. I did not ask what papers he was talking about, though I had heard enough of the conversation through the kitchen wall to understand the shape of it, if not the details. The man from the notary's office shifted in his seat. He had a thin mustache and soft hands. Hands that had clearly never carried a patient down 3 flights of stairs during a power outage. Hands that had never held pressure on a wound while waiting for the ambulance to come up the mountain road. He cleared his throat and looked down at his papers again, as if the silence in the room had grown too heavy for him to hold. Hui mistook my silence for surrender. I watched it happen in his face. Watched the tension in his shoulders ease. Watched him glance at the notary with something like triumph. He thought the old woman in the doorway, the old woman with her hands still smelling of incense smoke, had nothing left in her but a quiet, foolish smile. He had no idea what that smile actually meant. 31 years ago, on a night when the rains had flooded half of Ward 7 and the hospital generators had failed twice, I stood in an operating corridor and watched a young surgeon lose his nerve in front of a patient who was bleeding out on the table. I did not raise my voice then either. I simply stepped forward, took the instruments from his shaking hands, and did what needed to be done, while he stood frozen against the wall. Nobody remembers that night by my name. They remember it as the night Dr. Fan saved a man's life. I have never minded that. I learned a long time ago that the people who make the most noise are rarely the ones holding the scalpel. Stillness was never weakness. My husband used to say that water which runs the deepest makes no sound at all, that the loudest river is usually the shallowest one. He said it to me on our wedding night, half joking, half not, when I sat through the entire ceremony without crying the way the other brides had cried, without trembling the way they expected a young bride to tremble. I simply watched everything, memorized every face, every gesture, the way I had been trained to watch a patient's chart for the one number that didn't fit. That habit never left me. 40 years in a hospital ward teaches you to notice what other people miss. A flush in the cheeks that means fever, not embarrassment. A hand that trembles not from cold but from withdrawal. A signature on a chart that looks almost right but isn't quite the doctor's usual hand. You learn to read absence as carefully as presence, the missing entry, the skipped dosage, the blank space, where something should have been written and wasn't. I had been reading absences in my own house for 3 weeks now. The folder of property documents that used to sit in the bottom drawer of my husband's desk, gone. The deed that I myself had filed away after his funeral, the one I had read so many times I could have recited the survey numbers in my sleep, no longer where I had left it. I had said nothing about this either. I had simply watched, and waited, and lit my incense each morning, and let my son believe that grief and age had finally dulled me into something soft and forgettable. The notary cleared his throat again and slid a paper across the low table toward Hui. "Just a formality," he murmured, his eyes flicking toward me and then quickly away, the way people look at something they have decided not to see clearly. Hui signed where he was told to sign, his pen moving with the easy confidence of a man who believes the hardest part is already behind him. I lit a fourth stick of incense, though 3 was traditional, though 3 was what I had always done. I am not sure even now why I did it that day. Perhaps some part of me already understood that I would need an extra prayer before this was finished. The smoke rose thin and silver against the dark wood of the altar, curling past my husband's photograph, past his calm, steady eyes that had watched over this house for 6 years now, without ever once needing to raise his voice to be heard. Outside, the wind moved through the old tamarind tree in the courtyard, the one my husband had planted the year we married, and somewhere down the lane a motorbike engine sputtered and caught. The afternoon light was beginning to soften toward gold, the way it always did in this hour, the hour my mother used to call the hour when shadows tell the truth that daylight hides. I watched my son fold the signed papers into a leather folder and hand them to the notary with both hands, the gesture of a man closing a successful negotiation. I watched the notary slip the folder into his bag, without quite meeting my eyes again. I watched them both rise, exchange polite goodbyes, the kind of courtesy that costs nothing and means less. Bamboo bends in the storm, I told myself silently, watching the door close behind them. Bamboo bends, but it does not break, and it remembers exactly how far it bent. I stood alone in the quiet house, the incense smoke curling toward the ceiling, and I thought about the missing folder in my husband's desk, and I thought about the date stamped on the bottom of the document Hui had just signed, a date that meant nothing to anyone in that room except me. Because I recognized that date. I recognized it the way you recognize a familiar face in an old photograph, the way a nurse recognizes a heartbeat that doesn't sound quite right even before the monitor confirms it. That date belonged to a document that should not have existed at all. My name is Pham Thier Com Vun, though most people in this neighborhood simply call me Ba Vun, or sometimes, among the younger nurses who trained under me, Ko Vun, teacher, though I never set foot in a classroom in my life unless you count the hospital corridor where I taught 3 generations of young nurses how to find a vein in the dark. I was born in 1958, in a small commune outside the city, in a house with a thatched roof that leaked every monsoon season without fail. My mother sewed for a living, and my father worked the rice fields until his knees gave out, and neither of them ever imagined their daughter would spend her life in starched white, walking hospital wards at 2 in the morning with a flashlight in one hand and a chart in the other. I became a nurse, almost by accident. There was a recruitment drive in 1976, the year after everything changed, and the local cadre came through our commune looking for young women willing to train in the provincial hospital. My mother cried when I left, not from sorrow exactly, but from the strange grief of watching a child step into a future she herself could never have imagined for her own life. I trained for 3 years. I learned to read a pulse, the way other girls my age were learning to read love letters. Learned to recognize the particular gray pallor that meant a patient was slipping away before the machines could confirm it. Learned that the human body tells the truth long before the patient does, if you know how to listen. I met my husband, Duc, in my 2nd year of training. He was a military doctor, 10 years older than me, recently transferred to our hospital after years at the front. He had a quiet way of moving through the ward, never raising his voice, never rushing, even during the worst of the emergencies. The younger doctors flapped and panicked. Duc simply worked, calm as still water, and somehow the whole ward calmed down around him whenever he was present. He proposed to me in the hospital courtyard, beneath the old banyan tree that no longer stands there now, replaced decades ago by a parking structure. He did not get down on one knee, did not make any grand gesture. He simply said, "I have watched you work for 2 years now, and I have never once seen you panic. I think I would like to spend the rest of my life with someone who does not panic." I said yes, before he had even finished the sentence properly. We married in 1981, a small ceremony, mostly hospital colleagues, and a few relatives who had traveled from the countryside. I did not cry during the ceremony, the way brides were expected to cry, and afterward, Duc teased me gently about it, said that still water runs the deepest, that the people who make the least noise are usually carrying the most inside them. I have carried that phrase with me for 45 years now. I think of it more often than I think of almost anything else he ever said to me. We could not have children of our own. We tried for nearly a decade, visited every doctor we knew, prayed at every temple within a day's travel, and eventually we simply stopped speaking of it. The way you stop pressing on a wound, once you understand it, will not heal the way you hoped. I do not say this for sympathy. I say it because it explains everything that came after. In 1995, a boy named Hu came to live with us. He was not an infant. He was 19 years old, the orphan son of a colleague of mine, a nurse named Thu who had died of liver disease after years of working double shifts to support him alone. Thu had no other family, no one to take the boy in, and on her deathbed she asked me, her hand gripping mine with whatever strength remained in her, to look after him. I said yes, the way I had said yes to Duc beneath the banyan tree. Immediately, without calculation. Hui was a difficult young man in those early years, angry in the particular way that grief makes young men angry, prone to disappearing for days at a time, prone to falling in with friends who taught him habits I did not approve of. But Duc was patient with him in a way I sometimes was not. He taught Hui to play chess in the evenings, taught him to fix a motorbike engine, taught him, slowly, painstakingly, the kind of quiet steadiness that had made Duc himself such a good doctor. By the time Hui turned 25, something in him had settled. He found work, first as an assistant at a small construction firm, then eventually moving into real estate brokerage, which suited his particular charm, his ability to make strangers trust him within minutes of meeting them. I was proud of him in those years. I told myself the difficult early period had simply been grief working its way out of a young man's system, the way fever works its way out of a body, before the patient finally breaks into a sweat and begins to heal. Duc died 6 years ago, in the spring, of a heart that had simply worked too hard for too many decades. I was the one who found him, in his armchair beside the window, a book still open on his lap, his expression so peaceful that for a moment I thought he had simply fallen asleep reading. I held his hand for nearly an hour before I called anyone. 40 years of nursing had taught me to recognize death within seconds of seeing it. But some part of me needed that hour anyway, needed to sit with him one last time, before the house filled with neighbors and incense, and the particular chaos that follows a death in a Vietnamese household. I built his altar myself, arranged his photograph, his reading glasses, the small jade pendant he had worn every day of our marriage. I light incense for him every morning without fail, the way I have done for 6 years now, the way I expect to do for whatever years remain to me. After Duc's death, Hui became more attentive than he had been in years. He visited more often, brought me fruit from the market, sat with me in the evenings, and asked about my health, my finances, my plans for the house. I told myself this was simply grief drawing us closer together, two people who had lost the same quiet, steady man, finding comfort in each other's company. I did not yet understand that attentiveness, like silence, can mean entirely different things depending on what is hiding behind it. It began, as these things often do, with a conversation I was not meant to overhear. I had gone into the kitchen for tea, moving quietly the way I have always moved. A habit from decades of night shifts, when waking a sleeping patient could mean undoing hours of careful rest. Hui was on the back terrace with a man I did not recognize, their voices carrying through the thin wooden shutters in a way they had clearly not anticipated. "The market is moving fast on that stretch of road," the stranger was saying. "Once the new bridge connects through, land along here triples in value within 2 years. Maybe sooner. And my mother's name is still the only one on the deed," Hui said. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, a flatness, a calculation that made my hand pause on the kettle. "That's the problem," the stranger agreed. Without her signature transferring it, or without her passing, you have no legal claim at all. Adoption gives you inheritance rights eventually, but eventually isn't fast enough if you want to move on this before the bridge announcement goes public. I stood very still in the kitchen. The kettle warm, but not yet whistling. The steam beginning to curl from its spout, the way incense curls from the bowl on the altar. I did not move to refill my cup. I simply listened. The way I used to listen outside a patient's door, for the particular rhythm of breathing that told me whether the night would be quiet or whether I would need to wake the doctor. She trusts me completely, Hui said. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her if I frame it the right way. Bank paperwork, insurance forms, she barely reads anything closely anymore. She's 68. Nobody questions an old woman forgetting what she signed. I felt something in my chest go very cold and very calm, at the same time, the way I used to feel in the operating corridor when an emergency call came through, when panic was a luxury I could not afford, and clarity became the only thing standing between a patient and disaster. The stranger laughed, low and easy. The laugh of a man closing a deal he had already decided was a sure thing. Just bring me something with her signature on it. Within the month, he said. I can get a colleague at the district office to process the transfer quietly. Nobody looks too closely at family transactions. It happens every day. I poured my tea with hands that did not shake, though some part of me marveled, distantly, that they did not. I carried the cup back to my room and sat by the window for a long time, watching the tamarind tree move in the evening wind, listening to its leaves whisper against each other, the way they had whispered every evening for 30 years, indifferent to whatever schemes moved through the house beneath its branches. I thought of Thu, Hui's mother, gripping my hand on her deathbed, asking me to look after her son. I wondered what she would think now, watching her son plot to take a dying woman's trust and turn it into a signature on a deed transfer. 3 days later, Hui came to me in the evening with a folder of papers and a gentleness in his voice that I now understood, with perfect clarity, was rehearsed. Mère, he said, using the word for mother with the kind of warmth he had learned could open almost any door in this house. The bank needs updated paperwork for the property insurance. Just routine renewal. I'll handle all of it. You just need to sign here and here. He had marked the pages with small yellow tabs, the kind you might use to flag important passages in a textbook. I looked at the tabs for a long moment, and I thought about how many times over the years I had watched young doctors flag a chart in exactly this way, drawing the eye toward what they wanted, seen and away from everything else on the page. I did not refuse him outright. That would have shown my hand too early, and 40 years of nursing had taught me that the worst thing you can do in a crisis is reveal your full understanding before you have gathered enough information to act with precision. Let me read it properly first, I said. My eyes aren't what they used to be. I'll need my reading glasses and a quiet hour. Something flickered across his face, brief and quickly suppressed. The particular irritation of a man who has planned for an easy yes and received a polite delay instead. Of course, Mère, he said. No rush, whenever you're ready, but I saw it. I saw the flash of impatience beneath the practiced gentleness, and in that single unguarded moment, I understood with total certainty that the boy I had raised from 19, the boy whose fevers I had nursed, and whose marriage I had celebrated, and whose business failures I had quietly covered more than once over the years, had become someone I no longer fully recognized. He left the folder on the table beside my chair and went out to meet friends, the motorbike engine catching on the second try the way it always did, fading down the lane into the gathering dusk. I sat alone with the folder for a long time before I finally opened it. The paperwork inside was not insurance renewal at all. I read each page twice before I allowed myself to fully understand what I was looking at. The document was titled, Informal Language Designed to Discourage Close Reading, a Voluntary Property Transfer Agreement, the kind of phrasing bureaucrats use when they want a transaction to sound like a gift rather than what it actually is. Beneath the title, in smaller print, my name appeared as the transferring party, and Hui's appeared as the recipient, with a notary's stamp already pressed into the bottom corner of the second page. dated 3 days earlier, the exact day I had overheard that conversation on the terrace. The stamp was small, circular, the kind of official mark I had seen hundreds of times over the years on hospital transfer documents, on insurance forms, on the endless paperwork that accompanies both birth and death in this country. I had learned, over 4 decades of reading official documents in a hospital administration office during my later years before retirement, to recognize the particular weight and clarity that a genuine notary stamp carries, the crispness of its edges, the way real ink sits slightly raised against the page when you run a fingertip across it. I ran my fingertip across this one now, slowly. The way I once checked a patient's pulse when the monitor readings seemed inconsistent with what my hands were telling me. It felt wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that announces itself immediately, but wrong, in the way a slightly irregular heartbeat is wrong. A hesitation so small that most people would never notice it, would simply move past it without a second thought. The ink sat too flat against the paper. The edges of the circular stamp were not quite uniform, slightly thinner on one side than the other, as though pressed by a hand less practiced than it wanted to appear. I set the document down on my lap and looked up at my husband's photograph on the altar across the room, his calm eyes watching me the way they had watched me through every difficult decision of our 40 years together. "I am not yet certain what I am looking at, Duck," I said quietly to the empty room, the way I sometimes still spoke to him in the evenings when the house grew too quiet to bear in silence. "But I do not think it is what our son wants me to believe it is." I went to the small wooden cabinet beside the altar where I kept my husband's old papers, the ones I had never had the heart to fully sort through after his death. Among them, I knew, was a copy of the deed transfer we had filed together when we first purchased this house in 1989, a document stamped by the same district notary office that supposedly handled the paperwork, now sitting in my lap. I found it within minutes, my hands moving through the familiar stack with the muscle memory of someone who had organized and reorganized this cabinet 100 times in the years since Duck passed. I laid the old document beside the new one on the low table, side by side beneath the lamplight, and I leaned forward to compare them stamp against stamp, the way I once compared 2 blood pressure readings taken minutes apart to determine which one reflected the truth. The old stamp, genuine, decades old, carried a particular density to its ink, a certain confident weight in the curve of its lettering. The new stamp, the one supposedly affixed only 3 days ago by the same district office, looked thinner, paler, the lettering along its curved edge, when I held it close to the lamp and squinted the way I used to squint at faint readings on old hospital equipment, did not quite match. It was close. It was close enough that anyone glancing at it quickly, anyone who trusted the document because they trusted the person presenting it, would never think twice. But I had spent 40 years learning to notice the difference between what looks healthy and what actually is. I sat very still for a long while, the lamp humming faintly above me, the tamarind tree outside whispering against the night wind, the incense from that morning long since burned down to ash in its bronze bowl. I thought about Hui's voice on the terrace, flat and calculating in a way I had never heard from him before. I thought about the stranger's easy laughter, the casual mention of a colleague at the district office, the certainty that nobody looks too closely at family transactions. I thought, too, about the missing folder from my husband's desk drawer, the deed that had disappeared weeks before this new document had ever appeared, and a slow, cold understanding began to settle into my chest, the particular stillness that comes not from shock, but from finally seeing clearly something you had only sensed before in fragments. This was not the first transfer. Somewhere, perhaps already, perhaps weeks ago, another signature bearing my name had already moved this house, or some part of it, into hands I did not yet know. I folded both documents carefully and placed them back into the cabinet, beneath a stack of old hospital records where who would never think to look. And I sat in the lamplight a long time afterward, listening to the wind move through the tamarind leaves, waiting for the particular kind of clarity that always comes to me, eventually, in the hour before dawn. Because if this stamp was false, Then somewhere out there was a second one. Older, hidden, already filed, and I intended to find it before anyone realized I was looking. The second document found me before I found it. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside an envelope from the District Land Registry Office, addressed formally to me, the kind of official correspondence that usually announces nothing more interesting than a property tax adjustment or a notice about an upcoming survey. I almost set it aside unopened, the way I had set aside dozens of similar envelopes over the years, official paper that mattered less than it pretended to. Something made me open it that morning instead. Perhaps it was the stillness of the house, Hui gone since dawn on some errand he had not explained, the kettle not yet on, the whole world holding its breath, the way it sometimes does in the hour just after sunrise. I sat at the kitchen table, my reading glasses pushed up on my nose, and I slit the envelope open with the same steady hand I had once used to thread a needle into a vein in the dark. Inside was a notice. A simple, bureaucratic notice informing me, the registered owner of record, that a portion of the property at this address had been transferred to a new owner 8 months earlier, and that as part of a routine audit, the registry office was requesting confirmation of the original transferring party's identity. 8 months. I read the date twice, then a third time. My finger pressed against the printed numbers, as though pressure alone could force them to rearrange themselves into something less impossible. 8 months ago, I had been here in this house, lighting incense every morning, attending the funeral of an old colleague, visiting my sister in the countryside for 2 weeks in the spring. 8 months ago, I had signed nothing. I was certain of this, with the same certainty I once felt reading a chart I had personally filled out, the certainty that comes from a lifetime of trusting your own hands. And yet here, in formal bureaucratic language, was confirmation that a transfer had already occurred. Not the one Hui had brought to me 3 days after I overheard that conversation on the terrace. A different one. Earlier. Already filed. Already processed. Already, apparently, complete. I sat very still at the kitchen table, the notice trembling slightly in my hand, though my hand itself did not tremble. Only the thin paper, catching the morning draft from the window, I had left cracked open the night before. 2 transfers. The thought arrived slowly, the way understanding sometimes arrives after surgery, when the body knows before the mind has fully caught up, a kind of cellular recognition before conscious thought. There were 2 transfers. The one I had already found, hidden in my own cabinet beside the old genuine deed, dated only days ago. The one with the stamp that did not quite sit right under lamplight. And now this. A second transfer, earlier, already moving through the formal channels of the district registry, a transfer I had never been. The land registry office occupied the 2nd floor of a government building 3 streets from the old market. A building I had walked past countless times over the decades without ever once needing to enter it. I dressed carefully that morning, the way I had once dressed for important hospital meetings, a clean al-baba in deep navy, my hair pinned neatly at the back of my neck, my reading glasses tucked into my handbag, alongside the notice I had received 2 days earlier. I told Hui I was visiting my sister for the afternoon. It was not entirely a lie. I did intend to visit her eventually, perhaps even that same week. I had simply rearranged the order of my errands, and I had learned, somewhere in the quiet weeks since I first overheard that conversation on the terrace, that a small omission was sometimes the only protection available to someone in my position. The clerk at the registry counter was a young woman, perhaps 30, with tired eyes and the particular weariness of someone who has spent years processing other people's paperwork without ever quite believing any of it concerned her own life. I presented the notice, my identification card, and the case file number printed at its bottom, and I waited while she disappeared into a back room lined with metal filing cabinets that looked old enough to have witnessed several decades of the country's history pass through their drawers. She returned 20 minutes later with a thin folder and an apologetic expression. The original transfer documents from 8 months ago, she explained, had been filed through an independent notary office rather than directly through the district registry, which meant the registry only held a summary record rather than the full original paperwork. If I wanted the complete file, she said, I would need to visit the notary office listed on the transfer record directly. I asked her, as gently as I knew how, whether she could tell me anything about that particular notary office, whether it was one she recognized, one with a good reputation in the district. She hesitated, glancing toward the back room where her supervisor sat, before lowering her voice slightly. There had been complaints recently, she admitted, about a few smaller notary offices operating just outside the formal registry network, offices that processed transfers quickly and without the usual verification steps, offices that mostly handled, in her words, transactions families preferred to keep quiet. I thanked her, and I left the building with the thin folder pressed against my chest, my pulse steady, my mind already moving 3 steps ahead, the way it used to move during the most demanding shifts of my career, when a dozen small details all needed tracking simultaneously, and panic was simply not an option available to me. I did not go directly home. Instead, I walked 2 streets over to a small tea shop, where a former colleague of mine, a woman named Hong, who had worked for years in hospital administration before retiring to help her son run a modest law consultation office, still met old friends most afternoons. Hong had always had a gift for reading official paperwork, the way I had once read patient charts, instinctively, quickly, recognizing irregularities that less practiced eyes would simply pass over. I laid both documents on the table between us. The first transfer Hui had brought me with its slightly thin, slightly pale stamp, and the registry notice describing the second, earlier transfer to a stranger's name. I told her everything, quietly, over tea that grew cold between us, as the afternoon light shifted slowly across the worn wooden table. Hong listened without interrupting, the way she always had, her expression growing more focused, more serious, as the pieces of my story accumulated into something larger and darker than either of us had anticipated at the start of the conversation. When I finished, she sat back and was quiet for a long moment, turning the document slowly in her hands. This stranger's name, she said finally, tapping the registry notice. I think I may have heard it before. Not directly. Through my son's office. There was a case last year, a property dispute on the other side of the district, where a similar name appeared as the receiving party in a transfer that later turned out to be fraudulent. The notary office involved was eventually investigated, though nothing ever came of it officially. These things rarely do, unless someone with enough patience and enough evidence pushes hard enough to force the issue. Something settled into place in my chest as she spoke, a small, cold satisfaction that I recognized from years ago, the particular feeling of watching a diagnosis finally come together after days of confusing, contradictory symptoms. It was not joy. It was something quieter than joy, more useful, the satisfaction of finally understanding the shape of the thing you are fighting. I asked Hong if her son might be willing to help me request the official notary registration records for the office that had processed both transfers, the one connected to the stranger's name and, I suspected, eventually connected to the document Hui had brought to me himself. Official registration records would show whether this particular notary office, and the man whose stamp appeared on my own documents, actually held a valid government license to perform notarization at all. Hong smiled then, the first real smile of the afternoon, the smile of someone recognizing an old colleague returning to familiar professional ground after a long absence. You always did have a talent for finding exactly what was missing from a chart, she said. I think my son will be very interested in your case. I walked home that evening with a lightness I had not felt in weeks. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. The particular satisfaction of a woman who has stopped simply absorbing blows and started, quietly, methodically, building the case that would eventually answer every single one of them. The wind moved. I should have known the calm would not last. Irerusku. His footsteps, moving too fast across the courtyard, for a man simply returning from a normal day at work. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, the smell of garlic and ginger filling the small room. When he appeared in the doorway with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a difficult, grieving 19-year-old learning to live in a house that was not yet truly his. "We need to talk," he said. I set down my knife carefully, wiped my hands on my apron, and turned to face him with the same steady composure I had carried through every difficult conversation in 4 decades of nursing. "Of course," I said. "Sit. I'll bring tea." He did not sit. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge I had never heard from him before, not even in his angriest teenage years. "Someone has been asking questions at the district registry office," he said, "about the property transfer, about the notary." He paused, studying my face with an intensity that made the kitchen suddenly feel very small. "It was you, wasn't it?" I did not answer immediately. I have learned, over many years, that silence is often more informative to the person watching you than any words you might choose, and I wanted, in that moment, to see exactly how much he already understood, and exactly how much he was still only guessing. "I'm allowed to ask questions about my own house," I said finally, my voice calm, almost gentle. "Don't you think I have a right to understand what's been signed in my name?" His face shifted through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, then something closer to panic, before settling finally into a kind of cornered anger I recognized from animals, backed too far into a space, with no remaining exit. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "You're going to ruin everything. Everything I've built. Everything I've worked toward." "Built on what?" I asked quietly. "Built on whose signature? Hui?" The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. I watched something break loose behind his eyes, some final restraint giving way. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost all of its careful warmth, replaced entirely by something colder, more desperate. "The deal is already done," he said. "Both transfers are filed. Both are legally processed through a licensed office. There's nothing left to question, nothing left to undo. If you keep pushing this, all you'll accomplish is making yourself look confused, forgetful, exactly the kind of elderly woman who shouldn't be managing her own affairs anymore." I felt something cold settle into my chest at those words. Not fear exactly, but a clear, sharpening recognition of exactly how far he was prepared to go. I had heard those words before, in fragments, on the terrace weeks ago, in a conversation I was never meant to overhear. I understood now, with total clarity, that this had never been only about the house. This was about silencing me entirely, about reframing my own clear mind as confusion, my careful questions as evidence of decline. "You would do that," I said softly. "You would stand in front of strangers and call the woman who raised you, who nursed you through fevers, who paid for your education, who has never once asked anything of you in return, confused and incapable. You would say that about me." Something flickered in his face, the briefest crack in the cold mask he had assembled, and for one moment, I thought I saw the frightened 19-year-old boy who had once cried in my arms after his mother's funeral, terrified of a world he did not yet know how to navigate alone. But the moment passed as quickly as it arrived, smoothed back over by whatever desperation had been driving him these past months. "I would do what's necessary," he said finally, his voice flat. "The business I'm building depends on this. The investors depend on this. I'm not going to lose everything because you can't accept that some decisions are better made for you than by you." He turned and left the kitchen without waiting for my response, his footsteps retreating across the courtyard, the motorbike engine catching on the first try this time, the sound fading rapidly down the lane until the house fell silent again, except for the soft simmer of the pot, still cooking on the stove behind me. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time afterward, the knife still resting on the cutting board where I had set it down, the garlic and ginger still filling the air, with a warmth that felt suddenly very far removed from the conversation that had just taken place. I thought of the old proverb about the river that drowns the swimmer who only trusts what he sees from the bank, and I understood now that Hui believed the current beneath my silence had finally been exposed and neutralized, believed that 2 filed transfers and 1 threatened accusation of incompetence were enough to end this entirely. He believed he had already won, I walked to the altar in the front room and lit a single stick of incense, watching the thin gray smoke rise and curl toward my husband's photograph, his calm eyes watching me the way they always did, patient, steady, certain that whatever storm was coming, I would find my way through it the same way I had found my way through every storm before. Let him believe he had won. I had not yet shown him a single card from the hand I was holding. The records arrived 3 days later, delivered to Hong's son's office by a contact within the Provincial Notary Licensing Board. And Hong herself brought them to my house personally, late in the evening, when she knew Hui would be out. We sat together at my kitchen table, the same table where I had first read the registry notice weeks earlier, and she laid out a thin stack of official documents between us, with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who already understood the weight of what she was about to show me. The notary office listed on both property transfers, she said quietly, does not hold a current license. It held one, 8 years ago. Briefly, before it was revoked, following a separate fraud investigation in another district. Since that revocation, any document bearing that office's stamp carries no legal authority whatsoever. Every transfer processed through it, including both transfers affecting your home, is void from the moment of signing. I absorbed this slowly, the way I once absorbed difficult diagnoses delivered to frightened families, allowing the full weight of the words time to settle before responding. There was more. Hong slid a second document across the table, a copy of the original licensing revocation, filed 8 years earlier. The man whose name appeared as the notary on both my documents, the man with the thin mustache and soft hands, who had sat in my front room weeks ago beside Hui, processing what he called a routine formality, was not even the same person originally licensed under that name. The licensing board's contact had cross-referenced photographs from the original application file. The man who appeared in my own front room was someone else entirely, operating under a stolen professional identity, continuing to issue fraudulent stamps to clients who had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. I thought of him sitting across from me that afternoon, sliding papers toward Hui with practiced, professional ease, his eyes flicking away from mine each time I looked at him directly. I had sensed something wrong in that room weeks ago, some instinct sharpened by decades of reading the small, telling details other people overlooked. I had not yet understood exactly what that wrongness was. Now I did. But it was the final document Hong placed in front of me that broke something open in my chest that I had been holding carefully shut for weeks. It was a handwritten note, photocopied from somewhere in the licensing board's investigation file, apparently recovered during their inquiry into the fraudulent notary operation. It was addressed, in Hui's unmistakable handwriting, to the man impersonating the licensed notary, dated nearly a year earlier, months before the conversation I had overheard on the terrace, months before any of the events I believed had marked the true beginning of this betrayal. The note discussed, in plain, businesslike language, an arrangement to transfer partial ownership of my property to a third party in exchange for an immediate cash payment, structured carefully, to avoid requiring my direct signature or knowledge until the transaction was already legally finalized. It described me, in Hui's own handwriting, as the source, language so clinical, so detached, that for a moment I could not connect the words to the boy whose fevers I had once sat beside through entire nights, whose small hand I had held while teaching him to write his own name for the first time after he came to live with us. I sat very still at the table, my hands folded in my lap, and I did not cry, though something in my chest ached with a depth I had not felt since the morning I found Duc peaceful and gone in his armchair by the window. This was a different kind of grief, quieter, more complicated, grief not for a death but for the slow, deliberate unraveling of a trust I had built over 30 years, one fever, one meal, one quiet evening of chess at a time. A year. He had been planning this for a full year, long before I overheard anything, long before the first document appeared in my husband's empty desk drawer. Every gentle gesture of these recent months, every piece of fruit brought home from the market, every evening spent asking about my health and my plans for the house, all of it had been performance, careful and patient, laid over a betrayal already a year in motion. I thought of the old saying about water that runs the deepest, making no sound at all. And I understood now, with a clarity that hurt more than anger ever could, that I had spent my entire life believing stillness and silence were virtues, the marks of strength and self-control. I had taught myself to read absence in patient charts, to notice what was missing, rather than only what was present. And yet here, in my own home, I had somehow failed to read the silence accumulating in my own son for an entire year, mistaking his careful quiet for grief, for growth, for the slow settling of a difficult young man, finally becoming the steady person I had always hoped he would be. Hong reached across the table and rested her hand gently over mine, the way colleagues had comforted each other after losing patients we could not save, decades ago in hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. "You did nothing wrong," she said quietly. "You raised him with everything you had. What he chose to do with that is not a reflection of your care. It never was." I nodded, though the words did not yet fully reach the ache still sitting heavy in my chest. I looked toward the altar across the room, toward Duc's photograph watching calmly over all of it, and I wondered, not for the first time, what he would have done if he were the one sitting here now, reading his own son's handwriting, describing his wife as merely the source of an asset to be extracted. I think, somehow, he would have grieved the same way I was grieving now, quietly, without raised voices. And then he would have done exactly what I intended to do next. I gathered the documents carefully into a single folder, my hands steady despite everything, and I looked at Hong across the table. "I need everything filed properly," I told her. "Every record, every license revocation, every page of that note, not to hurt him more than necessary, but because the truth deserves to stand somewhere, it cannot be erased again." Hong nodded, already reaching for her bag, already moving into the practical, careful work of building something that could not be undone by anyone's quiet desperation. The grief would stay with me, I understood, long after this was finished. But grief, I had learned across 40 years of nursing, was never a reason to stop moving forward. It was simply the weight you carried while you did what needed to be done. I did not confront Hui again in the days that followed. I had learned, in the long, quiet aftermath of reading his handwritten note, that confrontation too early would only give him time to prepare a defense, to shift blame, to find some new arrangement of half-truths, convincing enough to muddy the clear evidence I now held in my hands. Instead, I returned to the kind of patience that had carried me through 40 years of night shifts, the patience of someone who understands that the right moment to act reveals itself only to those willing to wait for it without flinching. Hong's son, a careful young lawyer named Hui, met with me twice that week, in his small office above a noodle shop 2 streets from the market. He reviewed every document, with the same thoroughness Hong had shown at my kitchen table, cross-referencing dates, signatures, licensing records, building a timeline so precise it read almost like a patient's chart, each entry supporting and confirming the one before it. The most damning piece, Hui explained, laying the documents out across his desk in careful order, was not any single transfer or any single signature. It was the mismatch between the fraudulent notary's stamp on both of my documents and the genuine stamp still on file at the district registry from decades earlier, the one used on the original deed Duc and I had filed together when we first purchased the house. Side by side, even an untrained eye could see the difference once it was pointed out clearly. The curve of the lettering, the density of the ink, the slight, telling thinness along one edge of the fraudulent stamp that had first caught my attention weeks ago beneath ordinary lamplight. That single discrepancy, Hui said, was enough on its own to void every document built on top of it, regardless of how many signatures, how many notarized pages, how many careful arrangements Hui and his accomplice had constructed around it. A house built on a single false foundation, stone collapses entirely, no matter how skillfully the upper floors were finished. I spent the following days gathering what remained. Bank records showing the cash payment Hui had received from the stranger named in the second transfer, a payment Hui traced through 3 different accounts before finally confirming its full path. Photographs of the fraudulent notary, the man with the thin mustache, cross-referenced against the licensing board's stolen identity file. Copies of every document, organized chronologically, building toward a single undeniable conclusion. I did not tell Hui any of this was happening. I continued lighting incense each morning, continued preparing dinner each evening, continued accepting his careful, performed warmth with a calm, unreadable expression that gave away nothing of the storm gathering quietly behind it. I had spent a lifetime learning to keep my hands steady, while everything around me moved at the edge of crisis. This was simply one more patient, I told myself, one more careful diagnosis, requiring precision rather than panic. On the evening before everything would finally come to light, I sat alone at the altar for a long while. After Hui had gone out, 3 sticks of incense burning slowly in the bronze bowl, their thin smoke rising and curling toward Duc's photograph the way it had risen every evening for 6 years. I am ready, I told him quietly, the way I had told him so many things over the decades, certain he could somehow still hear me even now. Whatever comes tomorrow, I am ready. The wind picked up outside as I sat there, rattling gently against the old wooden shutters, moving through the tamarind tree in the courtyard with a restlessness I had not felt in its branches for weeks. Somewhere in the distance, low and almost too faint to notice at first, thunder rolled across the hills beyond the district, the first sound of a storm that had been building, unseen, for longer than anyone in this house had realized. I closed my eyes and listened to it, gather strength in the darkness beyond my window, patient, certain, inevitable. Tomorrow, I would let it break. Hui called the family meeting himself, which was, I would later think, the single greatest miscalculation of his entire scheme. He arranged it for a Sunday afternoon, 3 days after I had sat with Duc's photograph and told him I was ready, gathering not only myself, but the new buyer of the disputed portion of land, a heavy-set man named Mr. Tai, who had apparently grown impatient waiting for full legal clarity on his purchase, along with 2 of Hai's business associates. He hoped to impress with how smoothly and completely the property matter had finally been resolved. He wanted, I understood later, to present the whole arrangement as a tidy, finished success, a son dutifully managing his aging mother's complicated affairs. Everyone gathered together to formalize the happy conclusion. He had not invited Hui. He had not invited Hong. He had certainly not anticipated that I had spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly preparing exactly the kind of evidence that would make this particular gathering the worst possible setting he could have chosen for himself. I dressed that morning the way I had dressed for the most important moments of my nursing career. My hair pinned neatly, my best au dye pressed and ready, a navy so deep it looked almost black in dim light, the same color I had worn the day I buried my husband. I wanted Hui to see, when he looked at me across the room, not a confused old woman easily managed, but the same steady presence that had once calmed an entire emergency ward simply by walking through its doors. The guests arrived through the early afternoon, settling into the front room around the low table where, weeks earlier, the fraudulent notary had first slid papers toward my son with such practiced ease. Mr. Tai sat stiffly near the window, clearly uncomfortable with whatever tension he could sense but not yet name. Hui's business associates made polite conversation about the bridge construction progressing along the eastern road, the rising land values, the bright future, apparently awaiting everyone gathered in this room. I sat near the altar, as I always did, 3 sticks of incense already burning in the bronze bowl, their thin smoke rising steadily toward Duc's photograph. Hui stood to address the room once everyone had settled, his voice carrying the same easy confidence I had watched him perfect over recent months. Thank you all for coming, he began. I wanted to gather everyone together to formally close out the property matter we've been working through, and to make sure everything is fully transparent and agreed upon moving forward. He gestured toward me with a warmth so practiced, It almost convinced even me, for one brief moment, that perhaps I had imagined the handwritten note, imagined the cold calculation in his voice on the terrace weeks ago. My mother has been incredibly understanding throughout this process, he continued. At her age, managing complex property matters can become overwhelming, and I'm grateful she's trusted me to handle the details on her behalf. I let the silence stretch for a moment after he finished, the way I had once let silence stretch in a hospital room before delivering news. A family was not yet ready to hear, allowing the weight of the coming words to settle properly before I spoke them. I trusted you, I said finally, my voice calm, carrying easily across the quiet room, because I raised you to be a man worthy of trust. I have spent the past several weeks discovering exactly how little that trust was deserved. The easy confidence drained visibly from Hui's face. Mayor, he started, his voice suddenly careful, but I raised one hand, the same gesture I had once used to silence panicking interns in the middle of a crisis, and the room fell still around it. I reached into the folder, resting on my lap, and withdrew the first document, the comparison Coy had prepared, the genuine notary stamp from our original 1989 deed, laid directly beside the fraudulent stamp from the transfer Hui had brought to me himself. I held it up, turning slowly, so that everyone in the room could see clearly what 40 years of reading official paperwork had taught my own eyes to recognize within seconds. This stamp, I said, indicating the document Hui had asked me to sign, does not belong to a licensed notary. It belongs to a man impersonating one, using a stolen identity, after the original license attached to that name was revoked 8 years ago, following a separate fraud investigation in another district. Mr. Tai shifted forward in his seat, his earlier discomfort sharpening visibly into alarm. I withdrew the second document, the registry notice describing the earlier transfer, the one filed 8 months before Huey had ever brought paperwork to my own kitchen table. There was, I continued, a transfer to a third party, processed nearly a year ago, without my knowledge, without my signature, through the same fraudulent office. I did not learn of its existence until government correspondence arrived at my door entirely by chance. Hui's business associates exchanged uneasy glances. One of them rose halfway from his seat before sitting back down, clearly uncertain whether leaving now would look worse than staying. And finally, I said, my voice steady despite the ache still sitting heavy in my chest from the night Hung first laid this last document across my kitchen table. I withdrew the handwritten note, Hui's own writing, dated nearly a year before any of these events I once believed marked the true beginning of this betrayal. I did not read it aloud in full. I did not need to. I simply held it up long enough for the room to see the familiar handwriting, long enough for Hui's face to drain of whatever color remained in it, long enough for Mr. Tai to rise fully from his seat this time, his earlier impatience transforming rapidly into something closer to fury. You told me this property had clean title, Mr. Tai said, turning toward Hui, with the particular sharpness of a man realizing he has been the unwitting instrument of someone else's fraud. You told me your mother had already agreed to everything. Hui opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, the practiced ease that had carried him through every gentle deception of recent months finally, completely failing him in front of the very audience he had assembled to witness his triumph. I am not senile, I said quietly, into the silence that followed, my eyes fixed steadily on my son across the room. I am not forgetful. I am not, and have never been, someone whose mind could simply be dismissed because the truth it held was inconvenient. I set the documents down on the low table between us, the genuine stamp and the fraudulent one still resting side by side, undeniable, even to eyes far less trained than my own. Everyone in this room can see, plainly, exactly what was done, and exactly who did it. What happened next unfolded with a speed that even I had not fully anticipated, though I had spent weeks preparing for precisely this moment. Mr. Tai was the first to move, pulling out his phone with hands that shook slightly with anger rather than fear, dialing a number I did not recognize but could guess belonged to his own lawyer. I paid for that land in good faith, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room as he waited for the call to connect. "I have every right to report this transaction as fraudulent and demand my money returned in full." Hui turned toward him, his composure fully gone now, replaced by a desperate, scrambling energy I had not seen in him since he was a frightened 19-year-old, facing a world that had taken everything familiar away from him all at once. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We can resolve this between ourselves. There's no need to involve the fraud office," Mr. Tai interrupted, his attention already fully on his phone call, where the case officer dealt with the property fraud near the Eastern District last year. "I want to speak with the same investigator." One of Hui's business associates rose from his seat, smoothing his jacket with the careful, deliberate movements of a man already calculating how to distance himself from whatever was unfolding. "I think we should let the family handle this privately," he said, though his eyes did not quite meet Hui's as he spoke, and within moments both associates had gathered their things and slipped quietly toward the door, murmuring vague apologies that fooled no one in the room. Hui turned back toward me, something raw and unguarded, finally breaking through the calculation that had carried him through these past months. "Mayor, please," he said, his voice dropping low, almost pleading. "I was going to fix it. I was going to pay everyone back once the business stabilized. I never meant for it to go this far." I looked at him for a long moment, the boy I had nursed through fevers, the boy whose hand I had held while teaching him to write his own name, now standing in the wreckage of a scheme a full year in the making, finally facing the consequences he had spent so many careful months trying to avoid. "You told a room full of people I was too forgetful to manage my own life," I said quietly. "You wrote, in your own hand, that I was simply the source to be extracted from. You did not mean for it to go this far. You meant for it to go exactly this far, Hui. You simply never expected to be caught." He had no answer for that. I watched something collapse behind his eyes, the last remaining piece of the confident performance finally giving way entirely, leaving behind only the frightened, cornered expression of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what he had actually done. Mr. Tai finished his call and turned back to face the room, his expression grim but resolved. "The investigator is sending someone to collect statements and documentation this week," he said. "Given the scale of this, and given that this appears to be the same fraudulent notary office connected to last year's case, they're treating it as a priority matter." Within the hour, the fraudulent notary himself, the man with the thin mustache who had once sat in my front room sliding papers toward my son with such practiced ease, was located and detained by district authorities, his stolen professional identity finally unraveling under the same scrutiny Hui and the licensing board had quietly built over recent weeks. He confessed quickly, according to what Hui told me later, naming Hui as the one who had first approached him nearly a year earlier with the arrangement, offering him a cut of the proceeds in exchange for processing the fraudulent transfers without verification. Hui's business, the modest real estate brokerage he had built over recent years, collapsed within days as word spread through the district. Clients withdrew their contracts. Associates distanced themselves publicly, eager to avoid any appearance of involvement in fraud. The careful reputation he had spent years constructing dissolved as quickly and completely as morning mist burning away under direct sunlight, leaving nothing behind but the plain, undeniable truth of what had actually been done. He came to me alone, 3 days after the gathering, standing in the courtyard beneath the tamarind tree where Duke had once taught him to fix a motorbike engine, where I had once watched him learn patience from a man whose steadiness he had apparently never fully absorbed. "I have nothing left," he said quietly, his voice hollow in a way that might have broken my heart months ago, before I understood the full year of calculation, hidden behind every gentle gesture of recent times. "You have exactly what remains after the truth is finally allowed to stand on its own," I told him. "That is not nothing, Hui. It is simply less than what you tried to take through deception." He left that evening, taking only a small bag of belongings, and I did not yet know, standing there watching him walk down the lane for what felt like the final time, whether this was an ending or simply a long, necessary pause before whatever came next for both of us. I returned to the altar and lit a fresh stick of incense, watching the smoke curl upward into the evening air. And I thought of Huey's cruel words from weeks earlier, the easy certainty in his voice, as he told that notary, I would never remember enough to challenge him. I remembered everything. I had simply chosen, with the same patience that had carried me through 40 years of careful work, exactly when to let him see how much. The legal process took another 2 months to fully resolve, Hoy guiding each step with the same careful precision that had first uncovered the fraudulent notary's stolen identity. Both transfers were formally voided. The deed returned, clean and undisputed, to my name alone, exactly as it had stood since the year Duck and I first walked through this house together as young newlyweds, imagining a future neither of us could have fully predicted. Mr. Tai, after some difficult weeks of legal proceedings, ultimately recovered the full amount he had paid. The funds drawn from accounts, the investigation eventually traced back to Huey directly. I felt no particular satisfaction in this part of the outcome, only a quiet relief that an innocent man had not been left to absorb the cost of someone else's deception. I did not pursue criminal charges against Huey himself, though Coy assured me I had more than enough evidence to do so. I sat with that decision for many long evenings beside the altar, watching incense smoke curl toward Duck's calm, steady eyes, asking myself what he would have wanted, what kind of justice would actually heal something, rather than simply punish it further. In the end, I chose something quieter. The truth, fully documented, fully on record, available to anyone who ever needed to verify it, and beyond that, only distance, the kind of careful, deliberate space a person needs to understand fully what they have done before any path toward repair becomes possible, if it ever does at all. I did not become wealthier through any of this. The house remained exactly the modest home it had always been, its old wooden beams, its small courtyard, its tamarind tree now taller than it had been the year Duck first planted it. I gained no new land, no new fortune, nothing beyond what had always rightfully belonged to me in the first place. What I gained instead was something harder to measure and, I came to understand, far more valuable. My name, clean again on every official document, my voice, finally heard clearly by everyone who had once dismissed it as the confused murmuring of an aging woman, my quiet, which had once been mistaken for weakness, finally understood by anyone paying close attention as exactly what it had always been, the deep, steady current beneath a calm surface, carrying more strength than any loud rushing stream ever could. My sister's granddaughter, a thoughtful young woman named Mai, who had visited often over recent months, helping me organize the mountain of paperwork this entire ordeal had generated, became, in the quiet aftermath, someone I found myself trusting in a way I had not expected to feel again so soon after everything with Hui. She asked nothing of me. She simply showed up, week after week, carrying groceries up the lane, sitting with me in companionable silence while I tended the altar each evening, asking thoughtful questions about Duck, about my years in the hospital, about the life I had built long before any of this betrayal had ever entered it. I changed my will quietly that autumn, with Koi's careful guidance, ensuring that whatever remained of this modest but honest life I had built would eventually pass to Mai, along with clear, detailed letters explaining everything. The original deed, the fraudulent transfers, the full sequence of events, so that nothing in this family would ever again be vulnerable to the particular kind of quiet manipulation that had so nearly succeeded against me. On the evening I finished signing the final paperwork, I sat alone beside the altar for a long while. 3 sticks of incense burning steadily in the bronze bowl, their thin smoke rising and curling toward Duck's photograph, the way it had risen every single evening for 6 years now, patient, unbroken, exactly as it always had been regardless of whatever storms moved through the rooms beneath it. I thought of bamboo, bending in the wind all those months ago, holding its shape through every gust, remembering precisely how far it had bent, waiting patiently for its moment to spring back upright, with whatever quiet strength it had stored through the worst of the storm. I understood now, sitting in the settled stillness of this finally resolved evening, that the bending itself had never been weakness. It had simply been patience, the same patience that had carried me through 40 years of careful nursing work, through every difficult diagnosis, every long night shift, every moment when panic would have been easier than clarity, but far less useful in the end. Mai visited the following morning, bringing fresh fruit from the market the way she always did now, and we sat together in the courtyard beneath the tamarind tree, its leaves moving gently in a wind that carried none of the restless, gathering tension it had carried in the weeks before everything finally broke open into the light. "Are you happy, Ba Tum?" she asked me, settling onto the worn wooden bench beside me, her voice carrying the easy, unguarded warmth of someone who had never once tried to manage or manipulate the answer she received. I considered the question carefully, the way I considered every important question, turning it over slowly before allowing myself to answer. "I am steady," I told her finally, watching the tamarind leaves catch the morning light. "And after everything, I think steady is worth more than happy ever could be on its own." She smiled, and we sat together in comfortable silence for a long while. The incense from that morning's prayers still drifting faintly from the front room, mingling with the smell of ripening fruit and the particular, familiar quiet of a house finally, fully at peace. Still, water runs the deepest, I thought, watching the light move slowly across the courtyard stones, the way it had moved across this same ground every morning for nearly 40 years. It always had, long before anyone tried to convince me otherwise, and it always would, long after every storm that ever came through this house had finally, completely passed. If someone in your life has ever looked at you and decided you were too old to understand, too forgetful to be trusted, too tired to fight back, I hope this story reminded you of something important. Quiet does not mean weak. Patient does not mean powerless. Sometimes the people who underestimate us the most are the ones who end up learning the hardest lessons about exactly who we really are. If this story moved you, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. Have you ever had someone in your own life underestimate you, the way Hui underestimated her? And if so, how did you prove them wrong?